Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through the gilded halls and tumultuous battlefields of 17th century France. As the day's light fades and the world outside grows quiet, we will drift back in time to an era defined by opulence, ambition, and the iron will of a single man, King Louis XIV. We are embarking on a deep, expansive exploration of his reign, a period that reshaped Europe and etched his name into the annals of history. Our focus tonight is not merely on the grand spectacle of his power, but also on the subtle, often unseen threads that wove through his life. The complex tapestry of his wars and the intricate dances of love within his magnificent court. Tonight's narrative is designed to be a gentle guide, a calm voice to accompany you into the realm of dreams. We will move at a deliberate pace, allowing the details to form vivid images in your mind's eye without the harshness of a dramatic retelling. Imagine you are seated in a quiet library, the air thick with the scent of old books and dust motes dancing in the moonlight. We are simply turning the pages of history together, exploring a world that once was, a world where the sun never set on the French Empire and where the Sun King himself stood at its radiant center. Our story begins in 1638 with the birth of a child who was not merely a prince but a divine gift, or so his parents, King Louis III and Queen Anne of Austria, believed. After 23 years of a childless marriage, the birth of Louis Dieudonné, Louis the God-given, was seen as a miracle. This belief in his divine right to rule would become the very bedrock of his kingship. His childhood, however, was far from the fairy tale one might imagine. France was in the throes of a civil war known as the Fronde, a series of revolts by the nobility and the Parliament of Paris against the centralized power of the monarchy. These turbulent years, where the young king was often a fugitive in his own kingdom, instilled in him a profound distrust of the nobility and a burning desire for absolute control. He would never forget the fear and humiliation of being a boy king with no real power. This experience shaped his entire philosophy of governance and led directly to his later efforts to centralize all authority in the crown. The early years of his reign were guided by his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, a shrewd and masterful statesman who continued the policies of his predecessor, Cardinal Richelieu. Mazarin's influence was paramount, and it was he who taught the young king the art of diplomacy, the importance of a strong military, and the strategic use of marriage as a political tool. Upon Mazarin's death in 1661, the 22-year-old Louis shocked his court by announcing he would not appoint a new chief minister. "I will be my own chief minister," he declared, marking the official beginning of his personal rule. This was a moment of profound change, not just for France, but for all of Europe. The era of the Sun King had begun. The Sun King, a name Louis carefully cultivated, was no mere title. It was a complete philosophical statement. He saw himself as the center of the French universe, just as the sun is the center of the solar system. Everything revolved around him: politics, culture, art, and even the daily rituals of the court. His grand project to build the Palace of Versailles was a physical manifestation of this idea. It was a gilded cage for the nobility, where their every move, from dressing the king in the morning to attending his nightly suppers, was a carefully orchestrated performance. By keeping the nobles occupied with courtly life and dependent on his favor, he ensured they had neither the time nor the resources to conspire against him, effectively neutralizing the threat of another Fronde. But his reign was not just about internal control. It was also about external expansion and the projection of French power. Louis XIV's reign is synonymous with a series of major wars that aimed to expand France's borders and assert its dominance in Europe. From the War of Devolution to the Franco-Dutch War, and the larger, more devastating conflicts like the War of the League of Augsburg and the War of the Spanish Succession, his armies were almost constantly engaged. These wars were driven by a complex mix of dynastic claims, economic competition, and a relentless pursuit of what he believed was France's natural destiny as the preeminent power on the continent. The financial and human cost of these conflicts was immense, and their legacy would shape European politics for centuries to come. Amidst these grand political and military dramas, a quieter, more personal story unfolded within the walls of his court. The Sun King's life was also one of passionate, sometimes tumultuous relationships. His marriages and his relationships with his mistresses, or maîtresses en titre, were not separate from his political life. They were deeply intertwined with it. From his marriage to the Spanish Infanta Maria Theresa, a union sealed by the Treaty of the Pyrenees, to his long and deep relationship with Madame de Maintenon, a woman he would secretly marry in his later years, his personal life was as much a part of his reign as his wars. The court was a stage for love, rivalry, and betrayal, where the hearts of queens and courtiers alike were often played for political advantage. So, as we settle into this quiet space, let us open the doors to this extraordinary time. We will explore the grand projects and the great conflicts, but also the whispers in the royal gardens and the secrets hidden behind the tapestries of Versailles. Our journey is a long one, and we will move slowly, tracing the threads of Louis XIV's life from his uncertain beginnings to his magnificent yet complicated end. Now, let us begin our gentle descent into the past, where the Sun King awaits. As the last echoes of the Fronde faded, a young king emerged from the shadows of a turbulent childhood, bearing the weight of a nation on his shoulders. This was a young Louis XIV, and the lessons of his youth were etched deep into his soul. The Fronde, a series of civil wars that pitted the nobility and the legal body of the Parliament of Paris against the crown, had been a terrifying and formative experience. He had been forced to flee Paris multiple times, a fugitive in his own country, and had witnessed firsthand the chaos that a fragmented power structure could unleash. This period of instability, where the very legitimacy of the monarchy was challenged, was a crucible that forged his unyielding resolve. He learned that a king's power must be absolute, centralized, and above all, uncontested. This early fear gave birth to a grand ambition: to create a France where the monarch's will was law, where the nobility was subservient, and where the kingdom stood as the unrivaled power of Europe. This ambition was not merely a whim of a young ruler. It was a carefully constructed philosophy of governance known as absolutism. To Louis, a king was not just a ruler. He was God's representative on earth. This concept of the divine right of kings was not new, but Louis XIV would take it to its most spectacular and complete conclusion. He saw himself as a second sun, radiating power and light onto his kingdom, and he began to surround himself with a court that reflected this grand vision. The young king was a man of impressive presence. He was tall, with a regal bearing and an air of quiet authority. He had a passion for the arts and a deep appreciation for the performance of power. His days were a carefully choreographed ballet, a spectacle designed to reinforce his image as the Sun King. But behind the grandeur, the machinery of state was being meticulously rebuilt. Louis, with the guidance of his chief ministers, particularly Jean-Baptiste Colbert, began to implement policies that would strengthen the crown's control over the economy, the military, and the church. Colbert, a financial genius, worked tirelessly to reform the tax system, promote trade, and build a powerful navy, laying the economic foundation for Louis's military ambitions. The early years of Louis XIV's personal rule were a period of intense construction and centralization. His first major act of defiance against the old order came with the arrest of his finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet. Fouquet, a man of immense wealth and power, had built a magnificent chateau at Vaux-le-Vicomte, a palace so grand it was seen as a challenge to the king's own authority. Louis, on a visit to Fouquet's estate, was so enraged by the display of rival splendor that he had Fouquet arrested on charges of embezzlement. He then hired the very artists and architects who had worked on Vaux-le-Vicomte, Louis Levaux, Charles Lebrun, and André Lenotre, to create something even more spectacular: the Palace of Versailles. This decision was not just about building a magnificent palace, it was a profound political statement. Versailles was designed to be the physical embodiment of the king's absolutism. It would be a palace, a government seat, and a prison for the nobility, all in one. By moving his court away from the unruly streets of Paris to the countryside, Louis could exert total control. Nobles were required to live at court, where their daily lives, their access to the king, and their very status depended on their adherence to a rigid system of etiquette and ritual. The old feudal power of the nobility, rooted in their lands and independent armies, was being replaced by a new system where their influence was tied directly to the king's favor. The tranquil days of the early reign were a prelude to the storm. As Louis solidified his internal power, his eyes turned outward to the borders of France. He inherited a kingdom with a strong, centralized government and a growing economy, a perfect launchpad for his ambitions. His gaze fell upon the rich territories of the Spanish Netherlands, which he claimed through the inheritance rights of his wife, Maria Theresa. These were fertile grounds for conflict, and the stage was being set for the first of the great wars that would define his reign. The era of peace was slowly giving way to the drumbeat of war, a rhythm that would come to define the long and complex rule of the Sun King. As we drift further into this period, we can almost hear the quiet, purposeful hum of a new empire being built, brick by gilded brick, and the whispers of a king's ambition spreading across the continent. The ambition of a young king, forged in the fires of civil war, now required a stage worthy of its scale. That stage would be Versailles. What began as a humble hunting lodge for his father, Louis XIII, was transformed under Louis XIV into one of the most magnificent palaces in the world. The project was not merely an architectural endeavor, it was a political masterstroke. By relocating the entire court from the bustling conspiratorial streets of Paris to this new, isolated court, Louis successfully neutralized the power of the French nobility. He made them dependent on his presence and his favor, effectively turning them from powerful feudal lords with their own armies and lands into courtiers vying for the king's attention. The construction of Versailles was a massive undertaking, employing thousands of laborers, artisans, and gardeners. The palace itself was a symphony of Baroque opulence, from the Grand Hall of Mirrors, with its 357 individual mirrors reflecting the light of the garden outside, to the richly decorated royal apartments. The gardens, designed by the brilliant landscape architect André Lenotre, were equally spectacular, a triumph of human order over wild nature. With vast manicured lawns, intricate fountains, and geometrically perfect flower beds, the gardens of Versailles were a visual representation of the king's absolute control over his kingdom. Everything had its place, a reflection of the carefully orchestrated life within the palace walls. Daily life at Versailles was a meticulously choreographed series of rituals centered entirely around the king. This was known as the Grand Lever, the ceremonial waking of the king, and the Petit Coucher, the ceremonial putting to bed. Nobles considered it a great honor to be present for these events, and even a small task, like holding the king's shirt or handing him his slippers, was a sign of immense favor. These ceremonies served a crucial purpose. They kept the nobility busy and focused on the intricate pecking order of the court, leaving them with little time or energy to plot against the king. Their status, their wealth, and their very social standing were all tied to their proximity to the king and their ability to impress him. This constant, demanding court life was a gilded cage, but it was one the nobility willingly entered. Louis understood that a title without access to the king was meaningless. He used this system to reward loyalty and punish dissent. A noble who fell out of favor might find himself banished from court, a social death sentence that effectively ended his political career and ruined his family's reputation. By making social and political power synonymous with his personal favor, Louis ensured that the French nobility, once a threat to the throne, became its most enthusiastic supporters. The palace was not just a residence, it was the seat of government. Louis XIV governed from Versailles, surrounded by his ministers and advisors, who were all chosen for their ability and loyalty, not their noble birth. This was a deliberate move to bypass the traditional power structures and create a new system based on merit, but with a king holding the ultimate power. The arts flourished at Versailles under his patronage. Writers, composers, and painters were commissioned to create works that glorified the king and his reign. The era of the Sun King became synonymous with a golden age of French culture. From the tragedies of Racine to the comedies of Molière, all celebrated and supported by the king himself. In this environment of incredible wealth and intellectual ferment, the king's personal life also took center stage. The court was a theater where the king's affections were as much a matter of public fascination and political maneuvering as his wars. The very architecture of Versailles, with its endless corridors and sprawling gardens, was the backdrop for whispered courtships and discreet trysts. It was a place where love, like everything else, was part of the grand spectacle of the Sun King's reign. The stage of Versailles was set, the court was under control, and the king was ready to assert France's dominance on the world stage. The first major test of Louis XIV's military and diplomatic prowess came in the form of the War of Devolution, which began in 1667. The conflict's origins lay in a dynastic claim based on his marriage to the Spanish Infanta, Maria Theresa. Under the terms of the Treaty of the Pyrenees, which had ended the Franco-Spanish War in 1659, Maria Theresa was to renounce her inheritance rights to the Spanish throne in exchange for a substantial dowry. However, the dowry was never paid. Louis, a master of legal justification for his ambitions, argued that the failure to pay the dowry nullified the renunciation. He invoked an obscure inheritance law from the province of Brabant, a region in the Spanish Netherlands, which stipulated that property devolved or passed down to the children of a first marriage in preference to those of a second. This law, known as the Law of Devolution, was a flimsy pretext, but it was enough for Louis. He claimed that because the Spanish king Philip IV had been married twice, and Maria Theresa was the child of his first marriage, she had a rightful claim to the Spanish Netherlands. The reality was much simpler. Louis coveted the wealthy and strategically important territories of the Spanish Netherlands, which bordered France. The war began with a swift and decisive French invasion. The French army, led by the brilliant generals Turenne and Condé, was the most powerful in Europe. Their soldiers were well-trained, well-equipped, and loyal to the crown. Against them stood the Spanish army, which was a shadow of its former self, weakened by decades of mismanagement and constant warfare. The French forces met with little resistance, easily capturing key fortresses and towns in the Spanish Netherlands. The sheer speed of the French advance alarmed the other European powers, particularly the Dutch Republic, which feared that a powerful France on its borders would be a direct threat to its independence and trade routes. This fear led to the formation of the Triple Alliance in 1668, a diplomatic pact between England, the Dutch Republic, and Sweden. This alliance, though fragile, served its purpose. The combined threat of these three nations was enough to make Louis pause. He was not yet ready for a full-scale European conflict. Reluctantly, he agreed to peace negotiations. The resulting Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed in 1668, allowed France to keep some of its territorial gains, including several important towns and fortresses in Flanders. While the territorial gains were modest, the war was a significant victory for Louis XIV. It demonstrated the power of his army and his will to expand France's borders. It also served as a warning to Europe that the Sun King would not hesitate to use military force to achieve his goals. But a new chapter in Louis's life was also unfolding. Away from the battlefields, a different kind of war was being waged in the quiet salons and private chambers of the court. The king, though married to Maria Theresa, was known for his numerous affairs. The queen, a gentle and pious woman, was often overlooked. Louis's true affections lay elsewhere. At this time, his most prominent mistress was Louise de la Vallière. A young, shy, and genuinely devoted woman, Louise was a stark contrast to the political and social games of the court. Her love for the king was sincere and uncalculated, and for a time, Louis returned her affection, giving her 4 children. Their relationship was not a political alliance, but a rare moment of personal connection for the king. Yet, even in love, the Sun King's life was a public affair. Louise's position was a source of great scrutiny and gossip, and her eventual replacement by a more ambitious figure would soon change the dynamic of the court entirely. The court of Louis XIV was not merely a backdrop for political and military affairs. It was also a stage for the intricate and often dramatic plays of love, betrayal, and ambition. Central to this drama were the king's mistresses, who held a unique and powerful position. The role of the maîtresse en titre, official mistress, was a recognized institution at the French court. Unlike a secret affair, this was a public acknowledgement of the king's affection, and the woman who held this title often wielded significant influence, not just socially but politically. For Louis, these relationships were an integral part of his life, deeply intertwined with his reign and his public image. Initially, the young king's affection was captured by Louise de la Vallière. Louise was known for her gentle nature, piety, and genuine devotion to the king. Her love was sincere, and a refreshing contrast to the strategic alliances and courtly intrigues that defined so much of the royal world. She gave the king 4 children, 2 of whom survived into adulthood. Their relationship was a source of public fascination, and while she held no official political power, her quiet influence was felt within the court. However, Louise was ill-suited for the demanding and often ruthless environment of Versailles. She was a retiring figure who found the constant scrutiny and competition of court life deeply uncomfortable. As the years passed, Louis's attention began to wander, a natural consequence of the political and social pressures of his position. Louise's successor was a woman of a very different character. Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart, better known as Madame de Montespan. Montespan was a formidable force of nature, beautiful, witty, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. She saw her position not just as a matter of personal affection, but as a path to power and influence. Unlike Louise, Montespan thrived in the spotlight. She was the undisputed queen of the court, and her salons at Versailles were the centers of French intellectual and artistic life. She bore Louis a staggering 7 children, all of whom were officially recognized and given the surname de Bourbon, a sign of their royal parentage. Montespan's influence was vast. She used her position to secure favors for her family and allies, and her opinions carried significant weight with the king. She was a brilliant conversationalist, and Louis often sought her counsel, turning to her for advice on matters of state and culture. Her time as mistress coincided with the height of the Sun King's power and the construction of Versailles, and she played a central role in shaping the cultural and social life of the court. She patronized artists and writers, and her taste set the standard for fashion and design. The Golden Age of Versailles was, in many ways, Montespan's golden age as well. However, the world of the court was filled with dangers. Montespan's dominance was challenged by rivals, and her relationship with the king was eventually strained by his constant military campaigns and a growing sense of piety in his later years. The end of her reign as official mistress was tied to a major scandal that rocked France, the affair of the poisons. This scandal involved a network of fortune-tellers and poisoners who provided deadly concoctions and illicit services to the aristocracy. Though Montespan was never officially charged, her name was implicated, and the affair cast a dark shadow over her reputation and her relationship with the king. As Montespan's star began to fade, a new figure was rising in the king's private life. This was Françoise d'Aubigné, Madame de Maintenon, a woman who had been hired to care for Montespan's illegitimate children. Unlike Montespan, Maintenon was a quiet, deeply religious woman who sought to bring a sense of order and morality back to the court. Her piety and calm demeanor provided a stark contrast to the opulence and intrigue that had become commonplace, and she would eventually capture the king's heart in a way no one else had. As we move forward, we will see how this gentle but formidable woman would come to shape not only the king's personal life, but also the policies of his later years. The transition from the passionate, ambitious Montespan to the devout Maintenon marks a significant shift in the tone of the court and the king himself. After the limited gains of the War of Devolution, Louis XIV's ambitions were far from satisfied. The triple alliance of the Dutch Republic, England, and Sweden had forced his hand, and he would not forget the perceived humiliation. He saw the Dutch Republic, a small but wealthy Protestant nation, as the principal architect of this alliance and a major obstacle to his goal of French supremacy in Europe. The Dutch were a commercial powerhouse, and their global trade routes and Protestant beliefs were a constant source of friction with Catholic, monarchical France. Louis was determined to punish the Dutch and dismantle the coalition that had thwarted him. Over the next few years, Louis meticulously prepared for a new war. He used a combination of diplomacy and bribery to isolate the Dutch Republic. He signed a secret treaty with England's King Charles II, the Treaty of Dover, in 1670, promising him a large subsidy in exchange for his support against the Dutch. He also secured the neutrality of Sweden and several German states. By 1672, the Dutch Republic stood alone, a small island surrounded by powerful enemies. The Franco-Dutch War began in the spring of 1672. The French army, numbering over 120,000 men, was a military machine of unprecedented scale and organization. Led by the brilliant military engineer Vauban, whose expertise in siege warfare was unmatched, the French forces invaded the Netherlands. The invasion was a stunning success. The French army bypassed the traditional Dutch defenses and advanced deep into the heart of the country, capturing fortress after fortress. The Dutch government, caught completely off guard, was on the brink of collapse. The people, in a fit of desperation, turned against their leaders, leading to the lynching of the Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt and the rise of William III, Prince of Orange, as the new leader. William III proved to be a formidable opponent. His first act was to open the sluice gates, flooding vast areas of the country and creating a watery barrier that halted the French advance. This clever maneuver, known as the Water Line, saved the Netherlands from complete subjugation. The war, which had seemed to be an easy victory for France, now bogged down into a protracted conflict. Other European powers, alarmed by Louis's aggression, began to form a new coalition against France. The Holy Roman Empire and Spain joined the war on the side of the Dutch. For the next 6 years, the war raged across Europe, from the Netherlands to the Spanish territories in the Rhineland and the Mediterranean. The French army, though incredibly powerful, was stretched thin on multiple fronts. Despite this, they achieved several notable victories, including the conquest of Franche-Comté from Spain. However, the war proved to be a costly and ultimately inconclusive affair. The immense financial and human costs began to weigh heavily on France. The public, while initially supportive, grew weary of the endless fighting. The war finally concluded with the treaties of Nijmegen in 1678. France gained significant territories, most notably the Franche-Comté from Spain and several cities in the Spanish Netherlands. Louis XIV had succeeded in expanding his kingdom, but he had failed to crush the Dutch Republic. The war was a clear demonstration of the Sun King's military might, but also served as a warning to Europe that his ambitions were boundless. This conflict, born out of a desire for revenge and dominance, solidified Louis's image as a powerful but dangerous force on the continent, a reputation that would haunt the remainder of his reign. As the Sun King's power reached its zenith, a subtle but profound change began to take root within his private life, and, by extension, the entire court. The extravagant and public reign of Madame de Montespan was drawing to a close, not with a scandal, but with a quiet shift in the king's heart. Her successor, though never officially a maîtresse en titre, would become the most influential woman of Louis XIV's later life, Françoise d'Aubigné, Madame de Maintenon. Her rise from a humble, widowed governess to the king's most trusted confidant and, eventually, his secret wife is a testament to her intelligence, piety, and quiet strength. Maintenon first entered the royal orbit in the early 1670s when she was discreetly hired to care for the illegitimate children of Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan. Living in a quiet house near Versailles, she provided a stable and loving environment for the young royals, a stark contrast to the chaotic and public life of the court. Her piety and moral uprightness deeply impressed Louis, who was at this point beginning to feel the weight of his age and the guilt of his many affairs. He found in her a source of calm and spiritual guidance, a port in the storm of his public and private life. As Montespan's influence waned, Maintenon's grew. She was a constant, soothing presence in the king's life. She was not a political schemer, nor did she flaunt her position. Instead, she offered the king a genuine, intellectually stimulating companionship that he had rarely experienced. She would sit with him while he worked, and he would seek her counsel on matters both personal and political. Their relationship was one of deep affection and mutual respect, a stark departure from the passionate but tempestuous affairs that had defined his earlier years. She understood the king's burdens and his inner conflicts, and she used her influence to encourage him toward a more pious and serious-minded life. In 1683, the queen, Maria Theresa, passed away. After a period of mourning, Louis and Madame de Maintenon were married in a secret ceremony. The exact date is not known for certain, but it is believed to have taken place in late 1683 or early 1684. This marriage, a morganatic union, meant that Maintenon would not be crowned queen, nor would her children have any claim to the throne. However, it elevated her position at court. She was given her own private apartments at Versailles, and while she was never referred to as queen, she was treated with a reverence and respect that far exceeded her official title. Madame de Maintenon's influence was significant, particularly on the king's religious policies. She was a devout Catholic and a proponent of piety and moral reform. Her presence at court coincided with a period of growing religious intolerance, culminating in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. This edict, which had granted French Protestants, Huguenots, religious freedoms, was a hallmark of religious tolerance. Its revocation was a major step back, and while Maintenon's direct role is a subject of historical debate, it is clear that her religious convictions and the king's own growing piety contributed to the decision. This act led to the mass emigration of skilled Huguenots, a significant blow to the French economy, and earned France the condemnation of Protestant Europe. Maintenon also dedicated herself to education, founding the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis at Saint-Cyr, a school for poor but noble girls. She oversaw every aspect of the institution, from the curriculum to the daily lives of the students. This project was a source of great personal satisfaction for her and a lasting legacy of her time at court. As we move into the final tumultuous decades of the Sun King's reign, the quiet moral influence of Madame de Maintenon will stand in sharp contrast to the brutal realities of the next great wars that would once again engulf Europe. The 1680s were a period of immense change and growing tension in Europe. Louis XIV's aggressive foreign policy and his religious intolerance, particularly the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, had created a powerful and unified opposition. The Holy Roman Empire, led by the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I, and the Dutch Republic, still under the formidable leadership of William of Orange, were the two most significant powers arrayed against him. They were joined by a host of other German and Italian states, all wary of French expansionism. In 1686, these nations formed the League of Augsburg, a defensive alliance aimed at checking the power of France. The trigger for a new conflict was a dispute over the succession to the electorate of the Palatinate in Germany. Louis XIV, using a flimsy claim on behalf of his sister-in-law, invaded the Palatinate in 1688. This invasion, however, was just a pretext. The real goal was to seize key territories in the Rhineland and secure France's eastern border. This act of aggression ignited the War of the League of Augsburg, a brutal and widespread conflict that would last for 9 years. In Britain, the situation was further complicated by the Glorious Revolution, which saw the Catholic King James II, a French ally, overthrown and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, William of Orange. This put England squarely in the anti-French camp and added a powerful naval component to the League. The war was fought on multiple fronts across Europe and even in the colonies of North America, where it was known as King William's War. On land, the French army, though still the most powerful in Europe, was now facing a well-coordinated coalition. The war was characterized by a series of long and costly sieges. Louis XIV's generals, like the Duke of Luxembourg and the Duke of Villars, won a number of significant battles, but they were unable to achieve a decisive victory that would break the coalition. The French Navy, despite some early successes, was outmatched by the combined might of the English and Dutch fleets. The naval battle of La Hougue in 1692 was a major defeat for the French, crippling their navy and ending their hopes of invading England. The war took a heavy toll on France. The financial costs were staggering, and the constant demand for men and resources led to widespread suffering among the French populace. The years of fighting coincided with a series of poor harvests, leading to famine and social unrest. Louis, now in his late 50s, was no longer the confident young monarch of his early reign. He was a more somber and pious figure, increasingly influenced by the quiet morality of Madame de Maintenon. The endless stream of bad news from the battlefields and the hardship of his people began to weigh on him. By 1697, all sides were exhausted. The war had reached a stalemate, and a negotiated peace became the only viable option. The Treaty of Ryswick, signed in 1697, brought the war to a close. France was forced to give up most of the territories it had seized since the Franco-Dutch War, though it did retain Strasbourg and the province of Alsace. While not a complete victory for the League, the treaty was a major diplomatic setback for Louis XIV. It demonstrated that his ambitions of total Euro-European dominance had been effectively checked. The Sun King's era of unchallenged military might was over. However, this peace was to be a fragile one, a brief interlude before a much larger and more devastating conflict that would define the final years of his reign. The fragile peace established by the Treaty of Ryswick was merely a temporary reprieve. Europe held its breath, awaiting the death of the childless King Charles II of Spain. The fate of his vast empire, which included Spain itself, the Spanish Netherlands, much of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas, was the most pressing issue of the age. Two men had strong claims to the Spanish throne: Louis XIV, through his marriage to Maria Theresa, and the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I through his own Habsburg lineage. Both men had sought to secure their families' interests, and a series of secret treaties had been negotiated to partition the empire. However, Charles II, on his deathbed, made a dramatic and unexpected decision. He named Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his sole heir on the condition that the crowns of Spain and France would never be united. When Charles II died in 1700, Louis XIV faced a momentous choice. He could abide by the partition treaties, or he could accept the will and place his grandson on the Spanish throne. Despite the immense risks, Louis made the fateful decision to accept the will, famously declaring, "There are no longer any Pyrenees." This statement was not just a symbol of French ambition, it was a profound political act. By placing his grandson on the Spanish throne, Louis was effectively uniting two of the most powerful dynasties in Europe and threatening the balance of power. This was a direct challenge to the rest of Europe, and it led directly to the outbreak of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701. The war was a global conflict, fought on battlefields from the Low Countries and Italy to Spain and North America. The Grand Alliance, formed to oppose France, included England, now Great Britain after its union with Scotland, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire, among others. Their stated goal was to prevent the union of the French and Spanish crowns and to place the Habsburg candidate, Archduke Charles, on the Spanish throne. The war was defined by the brilliant military leadership of the Duke of Marlborough for England and Prince Eugene of Savoy for the Holy Roman Empire. The early years of the war were a series of devastating defeats for France. At the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, Marlborough and Eugene inflicted a crushing defeat on the French and Bavarian forces, a victory that shattered the myth of French invincibility. This was followed by more major defeats at Ramillies in 1706 and Oudenarde in 1708. The French armies were pushed back on all fronts, and France itself was on the brink of invasion. The financial and human cost of the war was immense, pushing the French kingdom to the edge of ruin. Louis XIV, now an old man, was forced to beg for peace, but the Allies' demands were so severe that he refused, famously appealing to the patriotism of his people in one of his final acts of defiance. The tide of the war began to turn in the later years. A political shift in Great Britain led to a change in government, and the new ministers were more open to a negotiated peace. Furthermore, the death of Emperor Joseph I and the subsequent accession of his brother, Archduke Charles, to the imperial throne created a new problem for the Allies. A victory for the Habsburgs would now mean the unification of the Spanish and Holy Roman Empires, a threat to the balance of power that was just as grave as a Bourbon Union. This new dynamic paved the way for peace. The war, which had consumed Europe for over a decade, was finally brought to an end by the Treaties of Utrecht in 1713. These treaties allowed Louis XIV's grandson to remain on the Spanish throne as Philip V, but on the explicit condition that the French and Spanish crowns could never be united. The final years of the Sun King's reign were marked by a profound sense of exhaustion and melancholy. The glorious victories and grand projects of his youth were replaced by the immense burdens of the War of the Spanish Succession. France, though it had endured, was deeply in debt. Its population was decimated by war and famine, and the royal family was in crisis. A series of devastating personal losses fell upon the aging monarch. In just a few short years, a measles epidemic swept through the court, claiming the lives of his son, the Grand Dauphin, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, and the Duke's wife and eldest son. These tragic deaths left a 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XIV, as the sole heir to the throne. Louis XIV, a man who had outlived his entire direct line of succession, now had to face the prospect of a long regency after his death. Despite these personal tragedies, Louis XIV maintained his regal composure and continued to govern, though his focus had shifted. The grandiose ambitions of his youth were tempered by a new sense of humility and piety. Under the influence of Madame de Maintenon, the court had become more subdued, and the king's daily life was increasingly devoted to religious devotion and reflection. He spent his final years working to restore France's finances and ensure a smooth transition of power to his young heir. He meticulously prepared his will, attempting to secure the regency for his nephew, the Duke of Orleans, while granting significant power to his beloved illegitimate son, the Duke of Maine. However, this attempt to bypass the traditional line of succession would be undone by the Parliament of Paris almost immediately after his death. On September 1st, 1715, King Louis XIV passed away, just 4 days before his 77th birthday, ending a reign of 72 years, the longest of any monarch in European history. His final words to his young great-grandson are said to have been, "I am going, but the state will always remain." It was a testament to his belief in the enduring power of the French monarchy, the very institution he had so completely centralized and defined. His funeral procession was a stark contrast to the grand spectacle of his life. The public, exhausted by decades of war and high taxes, met the cortege with a mixture of indifference and open mockery. The Sun King, who had demanded the adoration of his people, was laid to rest with a quiet, almost bitter finality. The legacy of Louis XIV is a complex and contradictory one. On one hand, he left France as the dominant cultural and military power in Europe, a nation with a highly centralized government and a magnificent capital. He was a patron of the arts, and his reign is synonymous with the height of French culture, fashion, and intellectual life. The splendor of Versailles and the works of Molière, Racine, and Lully are testaments to this golden age. On the other hand, he left France with a crippling national debt, a society marked by deep inequalities, and a legacy of constant warfare that had drained the nation's resources and sowed the seeds of future conflicts. His policy of revoking the Edict of Nantes had not only harmed the economy, but also created a legacy of religious intolerance that would long outlast him. As we conclude our journey through the gilded and bloody corridors of his reign, we are left with the image of a king who was, in many ways, an architect of modern Europe. He built a nation, but at a cost that was paid for generations. His absolutism, his wars, and his loves were all part of a single grand performance. A performance designed to convince the world that he was indeed the Sun King, the center of all things. As the final pages of his history close and we prepare to drift back to our own time, we are left to ponder the true cost of such ambition and the enduring, complicated legacy of a man who sought to control not just his kingdom, but the very course of history itself. Sweet dreams.